Hi, hello, how you doing? Today I wanted to talk about what makes a good villain. Every story has to have a villain, the counterpart to your hero, and they are just as important as your hero, if at times not even more so. Without a villain, there's no conflict and no story to tell. So figuring out how to write a good villain that truly enhances your story and brings forth all of the elements that makes your story good, such as internal conflict, external conflict, theme, enhances your setting, and gives your character their motivation is incredibly important. A villain can make or break your story. And without a good villain, there is a good chance that people will not like your book, or at least not as much as they would have if you had a good solid villain. So today I'm going to be sharing 5 tips on how to write a good villain that will hook your reader's attention and leave them wondering about this villain for weeks to come. The number one thing that you want to do when it comes to your villain is to make them human. The number one thing that I see people do when it comes to their villains, whether it is a baby writer or a published author, is that they don't put any human elements into their villain. Your villain is not a machine, even if they can be cold-hearted at times, something like a sociopath, a psychopath, a narcissist, or anything else that can make them come across incredibly cold and callous and calculated. Oftentimes, these behaviors in people are a mask and are designed to make the person come across with these elements, with that element of being cold, callous, and so on and so forth. It's a way to intimidate people, to set authority, and to let people know I am not to be messed with. However, that does not mean that behind that mask there isn't still a human. The same way that your protagonist is human, your villain is as well. But the way that I like to look at it is that they are just two humans experiencing life from the complete opposite perspective. That doesn't mean that your villain and your protagonist have to be completely different people, the exact same opposite in their personality and the like. They can have things in common. But the way that they view life or the situation that both of them have gotten entangled in is usually the complete opposite. That means that your villain has to have those same human aspects as your hero, because otherwise we cannot create that dynamic. Without the villain still being human, if living life and behaving very differently from what the average person would, we can't connect to them as a character and understand them as well as if we might have if they had more of those human aspects shine through. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that your villain who is a psychopath should at some point during the book just break down and start crying about all of their trauma. That is not what I mean. Psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissists are still human. It is still part of the human experience. You're gonna want to establish in what ways your villain being human can shine through, while also keeping up that mask of being cold, callous, or whatever traits you want them to present themselves with. A mask, no matter how well put on, always has some cracks in it. At some point, that mask is going to fall to the floor, even if just for a tiny second, and a crack is going to appear. A mask is designed to hold something in, and at some point it's going to burst. Especially when we're talking about a villain who is oftentimes a person who is in great pain. They often have a history that is incredibly painful, that has left them with quite a few scars or has completely changed their worldview to what it is right now. They often have unresolved trauma for which they should probably be seeing a specialist for, but instead they're bothering your main character. The way that they feel about the main character may be influenced by these things, on top of just the fact that they are, in the eyes of the villain, being a complete asshole for trying to get them to not reach their goals. You're going to want to look at where your villain is, why they got there, what their specific thought process is for why they do what they do, and merge all of those to bring your villain together. Your villain is more than just their actions throughout the story. Even if they are a full-on psychopath who barely experiences emotion, they're still human. And you're gonna want to let that shine through, at least somewhat. There has to be a tiny moment somewhere throughout the book that reminds us that they are more than just a robot. That there is something in the game emotionally for them. That they aren't just doing these evil things just because they can and just to spite society. That in itself is not enough. That in itself does not make a compelling villain. Their humanity makes them a compelling villain. Give them a clear and, if possible, personal motivation. Now, I have done a video on motivation before. It was actually my very last video. So if you want to get more tips on how to discover your character's motivation, I recommend going to watch that, because I will not be going over all the same points right now. But I do want to say your villain's motivation is just as important as your protagonist and as your main characters. Both good and bad have motivations and reasons for why they do what they do. I have heard one too many people say when talking about their villain's motivation, when they're asked why does their villain do what they do, oh, because they're evil. That's not a motivation. They may indeed be evil. They may indeed be a person that no one would want to touch with a 4-foot pole, or a 10-foot pole, or a 12-foot pole, or a 15-foot pole. That does not change the fact that that is not a motivation. Being evil is who they are as a person. However, it does not explain their actions. If they are looking to take over the throne, the fact that they are evil is not motivation enough. The fact that they are evil could also just show in other different ways. They don't have to want to rule over the entire continent to be evil. Being evil can also shine through in abusing other people, becoming a serial killer, arson, these types of things. Your character doesn't automatically want to have to be a royal or somebody who rules over the continent. Your villain can be evil and still be like,
you know what? Ruling the country? No, that's too much work. That's too much stress. Absolutely not doing it.
There is always a motivation, a very specific motivation tied to their actions, something that drives them forward. That when they sit in their bed at night, and as you do, start thinking about how, in the name of whoever, you got here in life, and they ask themselves, why am I doing this? That's the reason that pops up. And it should be strong enough that it drives them forward throughout the course of the story. Now, the villain's motivation may be a lot darker than that of your protagonist and of your main character. The hero's motivation may be about justice. It may be about helping people, or wanting just to make the world a better place, for example, them and their child to grow up in, because they are scared of what the world will do to their little baby once they grow up. Your villain's motivation might be rooting in wanting more power, meaning that they feel completely out of control in their own life and are trying to take it back by doing actions that hurt other people and most likely in the long term won't do them any good. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say that your villain's goal is to take over the kingdom. They want to sit on that throne and rule over the country. Now, for the villain to have such a big goal, that means that they also need to feel completely out of control in the life that they have now. Gaining more power and having the illusion of creating more control is not the same as actually having control. Once they are on that throne, there are still going to be people who oppose them and going to make them once again feel out of control. So when it comes to your villain's motivation, while it may make sense to them and may be the solution to all of their problems, a lot of the time villains are guided by their own misbeliefs. Whereas a hero, when they come across a misbelief, may try to fix it, a villain will indulge in it. Meaning that their motivation from an outsider's perspective doesn't always have to make sense. Make the villain evoke a strong emotional reaction in your readers. Now, this can be achieved multiple ways. Their actions may be incredibly despicable. Like, let's say, again, I'm just going to use this for the whole video. They want to take over the kingdom, and in the process they're heaving war and havoc, destroying towns and people's lives and the lives of children. That's gonna evoke a strong emotion, especially if this town happens to be the town that the main character grew up in, who at that point we are already connected to. We care about them and what happens to them throughout the course of the story, meaning that it will evoke a lot of anger and disgust as we read about their actions. It can also come through their motivation or who they are as a person. If their motivation is extremely personal, like let's say they had a son and a wife who were murdered, and that started off the chain of events that brings them to the actions, thought processes, and justification for why they're doing what they're doing throughout the course of the story. While that doesn't mean that we as the reader will say, okay, your wife and your child were murdered, so now what you're doing is okay, it does evoke empathy. It does evoke compassion while we still want them to change their actions and not win at the end of the story. Maybe the villain is extremely funny. That in itself is enough to help us connect to the villain in the same way we might connect to the main character and the protagonist. Do they genuinely, and this is a way that I personally can really connect to a villain, do they have good intentions, but their way of going about things is truly awful? That evokes two different conflicting emotions in the reader of, but he wants to do good, but his actions are horrible. But he wants to do good, but he is doing these horrible things. But I feel bad for him, but it's still not okay. Those types of emotions that are strong enough that when we are reading the story, they affect how we feel as the chapter, as the scene, the sentence goes on, will allow us to make a connection to the villain in the same way that we would with the protagonist, will help us care and will change our perspective entirely on what it is that we are reading. Any emotion works, but you have to set the intent of what you want that emotion to be when it comes to your reader. If you want the villain to evoke fear, you have to match their actions up with something that would evoke fear. If you want the reader to be repulsed, their actions should line up with something that would make people feel revolted and repulsed from the villain. You cannot describe an action that would evoke anger and expect fear. If the villain has hurt a child or a teenager, people who we consider to be innocent and in need of protection and defenseless, it's going to spark anger. It's going to spark disgust. So you cannot use that in the book or actions to it that are similar multiple times and expect fear to come up in the reader. If you want to evoke fear, you have to match up those actions. And your villain is a great tool in order to achieve any emotion that you want within your reader, especially emotions that range from neutral to negative. And with your protagonist, it would be from neutral to positive. Both of them are great tools to achieve the same goal, which is heavy and intense emotion while reading. And last but not least, your villain has to be a good, worthy opponent. Your villain has to pose a genuine threat. And not just to the protagonist, but to the surroundings of the protagonist. To the protagonist's friends, to their loved ones, their family, to, I don't know, their dog, their cat, their gerbil, their pet turtle, anything that is important to your protagonist, to your main character. If the villain does not pose a genuine threat, we from the very beginning will already be like, nah, this is gonna turn out fine anyway. When the villain is the exact opposite, a true threat, something that we feel, how are you supposed to win and triumph over that? We get invested. We want to know more. We want to know how the protagonist, the main character, is possibly going to get themselves out of this sticky situation. Without that, your reader might actually get frustrated that the main character is not just simply doing this tiny thing that could eradicate this entire problem. We want to be able to rely on the protagonist to get us emotionally stable again after reading about the situation that they are in. We want the actions of the protagonist to help us feel okay. Even if we are not there physically in the story, there is still the sense for us in our brain of, save me from what I am feeling right now, please. We don't have that if the villain is not somebody who is incredibly strong or a genuine threat to the main character. That's just gonna cause us to get frustrated because there's a solution there and everybody is making it overcomplicated. And that's gonna make you resentful towards the villain. And you never want to feel resentful towards a villain as a reader for not being a good villain. That's quite the opposite of what you want. Your villain is there to add tension. Your villain is there to make sure that there is a story. A villain who poses a threat evokes emotion. It gives your character a stronger motivation, forces your main character to face their demons, their misbelief, and look at their actions from a whole new perspective, both the actions of themselves as well as the actions of the villain, in a way that is for them uncomfortable, in a way that they don't want to do. They force character growth that they themselves oftentimes cannot experience because they are stuck and go along with these destructive behaviors. Your villain enforces in the main character what they themselves could never achieve, which is emotional growth, which is peace and harmony, and a desire to achieve exactly that. If your villain is weak, if your villain does not evoke any of those things, your villain needs to be much more fleshed out. Your villain needs to have a lot more work done. Now, a villain and how they become a worthy opponent, whether it is through their actions, their ruthlessness, their absolutely lack of empathy, sympathy, or care for human life, or the fact that there is no reasoning with them, that is up to you. Because there are multiple ways that a person can become a threat, including the things that I mentioned before, or just the amount of power that they already have and the way that they are misusing it, as we are currently seeing with some things in the real world. Also, things like mental illness can make somebody a threat in extreme cases. But let's look at villains like the Joker. While I love him as a villain, I would not want that man to be mad at me or to see me as a threat. Mental illness can make somebody, and this is me speaking from personal experience, a bad person. Especially if we are unable to, for example, recognize that we are sick. That is something that is being used more and more in stories as the years go by and as more books are being published. And it is also a tool that you can start using, as long as you do so respectfully and don't fall back into stereotypes. Like a common example, people with DID being exactly like the movie Split. Don't do that. But that doesn't mean that you can't use, for example, mental illness or mental illness induced by something like a physical illness, like a brain tumor, which can give people delusions, etc., in order to form a good villain and help them be a worthy opponent. There are so many ways to achieve this. It just has to be realistic, believable, and original. And that is different to every single story and means that you should probably go right and look at your villain. So these were 5 tips on how to help you form a better villain for your story. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you found these tips helpful and that the next time you sit down to look at your villain, you may now have more ideas on how to make them fit better in your story. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and watch my video on character motivation, which I do feel really goes along well with this specific video. So don't forget to go watch that one. Then I hope that you have a great rest of the week. I hope that you get a lot of writing done, and I will see you next Saturday. Bye bye.